Some men buy sports cars when they want to feel powerful. Some men build skyscrapers. Scott Davis slapped a pregnant nurse in a hospital corridor on a Wednesday afternoon and walked away smiling. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was not knowing who she was married to. Welcome back to Dad's Sweet Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, every villain in these stories thought they were the smartest person in the room. They were not. Subscribe so you never miss a story. My name is Gavin Barnes. I am 44 years old. I have been a federal judge in the Southern District of Georgia for 6 years. I drink my coffee without sugar because life is already sweet enough, and I am, by every professional measure, one of the most impartial men in the state of Georgia, except for one Wednesday afternoon in October. On that particular Wednesday, impartiality took a brief, well-deserved vacation. Let me explain. Grace Barnes is the kind of woman who makes the medical profession look easy. She has been a labor and delivery nurse at Savannah Memorial Hospital for 11 years. She held the hands of frightened mothers at 3 a.m. She has talked panicking fathers off ledges that weren't literal but felt that way. She has worked double shifts without complaint, eaten cold cafeteria food standing up, and gone home smelling like antiseptic with a smile on her face because she genuinely, profoundly loves what she does. She is also, as of last October, 7 months pregnant with our first child, a boy. We'd already named him Daniel Raymond Barnes, after my father and Grace's grandfather. We had a nursery half-painted in a soft sage green on Oleander Avenue, a name written in wooden letters above the crib, and a future that felt so full it almost hurt to look at directly. I didn't know yet that a man I'd never met was about to reach into that future and leave a handprint on it. Grace called me at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday. I was in chambers reviewing briefs for a securities fraud case that had been sitting on my docket for 3 months. A case, I should mention, that would become spectacularly relevant to this story in ways I could not have imagined at the time. Her voice on the phone was the kind of steady that people use when they are working very hard not to be anything else. "Gavin," she said. "Hey, you okay? I need you to stay calm." I put the brief down. "Grace, I'm fine. Daniel's fine. A breath. Something happened at work." Scott Davis arrived at Savannah Memorial Hospital at 1:15 p.m. that Wednesday for a private consultation. He was there to visit his mother, Eleanor Davis, who was recovering from hip replacement surgery in a private suite on the 4th floor. Eleanor Davis had a dedicated care team, a private room that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent, and a standing request that the floor be kept quiet during her afternoon rest period. Scott Davis was 53 years old, worth approximately $4.2 billion according to the last Forbes estimate, and had the personality of a man who had never once in his adult life been told no by anyone who wanted to keep their job. He ran Davis Capital Group, a sprawling private equity firm headquartered in Atlanta, with fingers in real estate, healthcare, logistics, and at least 3 industries I would learn about later through federal documents. He was known in Georgia business circles as aggressive, brilliant, and entirely without the social constraints that inconvenience ordinary people. He was also, on this particular Wednesday, running late and irritated about it. Grace was coming around the corner of the 4th floor corridor, pushing a medication cart, 7 months pregnant, in scrubs, moving carefully the way pregnant women in the 3rd trimester move, deliberately aware of their own center of gravity. Scott Davis was moving the way men who own things move, fast forward, with the assumption that the world will rearrange itself to accommodate them. They nearly collided. The medication cart clipped his jacket sleeve, and Scott Davis, $4.2 billion, 53 years old, in front of at least 4 witnesses including a hospital security camera that recorded everything in high definition, drew his right hand back and slapped my pregnant wife across the face, open-handed, hard enough that Grace stumbled sideways and caught herself against the corridor wall. And then he straightened his jacket and walked away, smiling. Nobody stopped him, not because they didn't want to, because they were too stunned to move. "He hit you," I said. "It was a slap, Gavin. He hit my pregnant wife. I'm okay. I went to the ER. They checked Daniel. He's fine. His heartbeat is..." "Grace." My voice had gone somewhere very quiet. That happens sometimes. When I am the most serious I have ever been about anything, my voice drops instead of rising. My law clerks know that voice. It makes them sit up straighter. "Tell me his name." A pause. "Gavin, tell me his name." The securities fraud case. 3 months on my docket. The universe, I have found, has a very specific sense of humor. Okay, I said. Okay? That's... Gavin, what does okay mean? It means come home when your shift ends, and let me make you dinner. You're being very calm and it's scaring me. I'm always calm, sweetheart. You're using your courtroom voice. Am I, Gavin, Grace? Is Daniel okay? My cheek is sore, and I'm furious. Good, I said. Hold on to the furious. You're going to want it later. I hung up, sat in my chambers for approximately 45 seconds. Then I called my clerk. Kenny, I said, pull the Davis Capital Group file for me. The securities fraud case. Kenny R. has been my clerk for 3 years. He is 28, Yale Law, and constitutionally incapable of being rattled. He was quiet for exactly 1 second. Judge Barnes, he said carefully, is everything all right? Pull the file, Kenny. Yes, sir. I didn't tell Kenny what had happened. Not yet. Because what I was about to do required absolute precision, and precision requires thinking before speaking. Always. Let me tell you about the securities fraud case. Davis Capital Group had been under federal investigation for 22 months. The allegation, supported by a substantial paper trail that the prosecution had been assembling with the patience of people who understood exactly what they were building, was that Scott Davis had orchestrated a scheme to artificially inflate the valuations of 3 healthcare companies, in which his firm held significant positions, sell at the peak, and leave retail investors holding worthless stock, while Davis Capital walked away with north of $300 million in fraudulent gains. It was, in the language of federal prosecution, a beautiful case. Collaborating witnesses. Digital communications that read like a screenplay written by someone who had never heard the word subpoena. The case had been assigned to my docket 3 months earlier through the standard random assignment process. Scott Davis's legal team, 4 partners from one of Atlanta's most expensive firms, had spent those 3 months filing motions, requesting continuances, and doing everything that expensive lawyers do when they are buying time for a client who is very, very guilty. They had also, according to information that reached me through channels I will describe shortly, been working on a different strategy entirely. They had been identifying the judge, me, and they had been preparing to approach me, not to argue the law, to buy it. I know this because Milton Reese told me. Milton is a 20-year veteran of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Atlanta. We went to law school together at Emory. We have had dinner approximately twice a year for 15 years, and we share the specific bond of men who have spent their careers watching the powerful avoid consequences, and decided individually and together that this was not acceptable. He called me the Thursday after Grace's incident, before I could call him. Gavin, he said, I need to talk to you about something sensitive. Go ahead. We have reason to believe that someone connected to the Davis Capital defense team has been making inquiries about your personal finances, your mortgage, your wife's income, he paused, your lifestyle. They're looking for leverage, or a price point. I was quiet for a moment. How long have you known? Milton. I leaned back in my chair. Scott Davis slapped my pregnant wife in a hospital corridor on Wednesday. Silence. Come again, Milton said. Open hand. 4th floor corridor. Savannah Memorial. 4 witnesses and a security camera. A very long pause. Gavin, Milton said slowly, please tell me you're not about to do something that ends your career. I'm going to do something, I said, that ends his. That's not the same. I'm going to recuse myself from the case, Milton. Today, formally, properly, with full documentation of the reason. And then, I said, I'm going to make a phone call. I filed my recusal that Thursday morning. The documentation was precise, formal, and complete. I cited a personal conflict of interest, an incident involving my spouse and the defendant, and requested immediate reassignment of the case. My recusal filing was a matter of public record by noon. By 12:30 p.m., it had been picked up by the Savannah Morning News. By 2 p.m., it was on the Atlanta Journal-Constitution's website under the headline, Federal Judge Recuses from Davis Capital Case Following Alleged Incident Involving His Pregnant Wife. By 4 p.m., the hospital security footage, obtained by a journalist through a public records request, with a speed that suggested someone had made a very helpful phone call, was on every local news station in Georgia. Scott Davis, slapping a pregnant nurse, walking away smiling, on a loop. I didn't make that particular phone call, but I know a journalist named Lauren Chu who has covered the federal courts beat in Savannah for 9 years, and who has, on multiple occasions, demonstrated an extraordinary instinct for knowing when a public records request might yield something significant. Lauren and I have never discussed the specifics of what she does with the instincts she has. That is how professional relationships work. The footage did what footage of a billionaire slapping a pregnant woman does. It detonated. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed 11 million times. Within 48 hours, it was national news. Scott Davis's PR team issued a statement describing the incident as an accidental contact during a stressful personal moment. The internet, displaying its characteristic generosity of spirit, responded to this characterization with approximately what you'd expect. Former employees of Davis Capital began to emerge. Women who had been spoken to in ways that HR had quietly settled. Men who had been threatened, demoted, or dismissed for questioning Davis's methods. A picture assembled itself in public view, not of an isolated incident, but of a pattern, a temperament, a man who had spent decades doing exactly what he wanted to the people around him, because nobody had ever made him stop. Meanwhile, Milton was moving. The bribery inquiry, the investigation into whether Davis's legal team had been attempting to identify leverage or a price point with a sitting federal judge, accelerated significantly when it became a politically visible case. Resources that had been trickling became a flood. A grand jury that had been considering the securities fraud charges began hearing additional testimony, and the case was reassigned to Judge Paula Whitmore. Paula Whitmore had been on the federal bench for 14 years. She was 61 years old, had grown up in rural Alabama, had put herself through law school on scholarships and sheer stubbornness, and had approximately zero patience for men who confuse net worth with untouchability. I have known Paula for 11 years. I called her the day the reassignment came through. Paula, I said. Gavin. Her voice was warm but precise, the way Paula always was. I heard about Grace. How is she? She's good. Daniel's good. Good. A pause. I got the Davis case. I heard. Interesting case. Very. Another pause, then Paula said very quietly, I don't need any help from you, Gavin. I want to be clear about that. I know you don't. I'm going to run this case exactly the way I run every case. I know that too. Then why are you calling? I smiled. To tell you about the bribery inquiry, I said. Milton's team is going to be in touch. There may be additional charges. A very long pause. Additional charges, Paula repeated. It appears that while Scott Davis was committing securities fraud, his legal team was simultaneously attempting to compromise a federal judge. On top of the fraud, it would. Gavin. Paula. How long have you known about the bribery inquiry? Long enough, I said. She was quiet for a moment. You recused yourself at exactly the right time. I recuse myself when I have a conflict of interest, I said. That's what the rules require. Of course, she said, and I could hear underneath the professional precision something that sounded almost like satisfaction. I'll expect Milton's call. He'll be in touch tomorrow. Gavin, she said before she hung up, tell Grace I said she's a hell of a woman. She already knows, I said, but I'll tell her anyway. The trial of Scott Davis began on a Monday in March. Grace was 3 weeks postpartum. Daniel Raymond Barnes had arrived on a Tuesday in February. 7 pounds 4 ounces, Grace's nose, my stubbornness, and a set of lungs that suggested a future in either opera or professional complaining. He was, objectively, the most extraordinary person I had ever encountered. He was also entirely unaware that his arrival had coincided with the slow, systematic dismantling of the man who had struck his mother. I did not attend the trial. That would have been inappropriate. I followed it the way any citizen follows a public federal proceeding, through reporting, public documents, and the occasional dinner with people who were willing to discuss matters of public record. What I can tell you is this. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Gary Fontaine, a 40-year-old former public defender from Macon who prosecuted financial crimes with the focused intensity of a man who had spent his early career watching poor people go to prison for stealing televisions, presented a case that was, by every account, comprehensive. The paper trail was exactly what it had always been. Clean, documented, devastating. The cooperating witnesses, former Davis Capital analysts, who had been present during the relevant transactions, and who had, in the months since the footage went viral, decided that their loyalty to Scott Davis was worth considerably less than their earlier estimates, were credible, detailed, consistent. The digital communications were, in the words of one courtroom observer, like reading a man's diary of his own crimes. And then there was the obstruction charge, the attempt to identify leverage against a sitting federal judge. The conversations that Milton's team had recorded, the emails that the grand jury had subpoenaed, the moment when Scott Davis's fraud case became something significantly larger and more serious than a fraud case. His legal team tried everything. They argued the surveillance was improper. They challenged the cooperating witnesses. They attacked the digital evidence chain of custody with a kind of forensic creativity that costs approximately $1,000 an hour. Paula Whitmore let them argue everything they wanted to argue, and then she instructed the jury with the clean, precise, completely unadorned language of a woman who had been doing this for 14 years, and had long ago lost interest in theater. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I was home when Kenny called me with the verdict. Grace was nursing Daniel in the living room. The sage green nursery was finished. The wooden letters above the crib spelled out a name that belonged to a boy who would grow up in a world where, on at least one occasion, the right thing happened. Judge Barnes, Kenny said, "Guilty. All counts." I sat with that for a moment. "Thank you, Kenny." "Sir, how are you feeling?" "Hungry," I said. "I'm going to make dinner." He laughed. I hung up. Grace looked up from the couch. She read my face the way she has always read my face, immediately, completely, without effort. "Guilty," she said. "All counts." He was entirely unbothered, as newborns tend to be, by the proceedings of the adult world. "Good," she said quietly. "Just that. Good." Scott Davis was sentenced on a Friday in May. Judge Paula Whitmore sentenced him to 19 years in federal prison on the securities fraud charges. An additional 7 years, to run consecutively, on the obstruction charges. 26 years. Scott Davis is 53 years old. You do the math. Davis Capital Group, without its founder, and with its reputation in the specific condition that 11 million views of a slapping video leaves a reputation, did not survive the trial. The board dissolved the firm in February. Assets were liquidated. Creditors formed an orderly line that stretched by some accounts around the block. His legal team, the 4 partners who had been so creatively investigating a sitting federal judge's price point, faced their own bar complaints, and in 2 cases, their own criminal referrals. That process is ongoing as of this writing, and I will not speculate on its outcome, because I am, professionally, a man who respects due process, even when due process is being applied to people who richly deserve what's coming. Gary Fontaine sent Grace flowers after the sentencing, yellow roses, with a note that said simply, "For Daniel, may he grow up in a more just world." Grace put the note in Daniel's baby book. Between his first footprint and the photo of the 3 of us leaving the hospital, Milton came to dinner the following Saturday. He brought wine, played with Daniel for 45 minutes, with the focused delight of a man who spends his professional life surrounded by crime, and finds babies a welcome corrective, and ate 2 helpings of the pot roast Grace made despite being 3 months postpartum, and also a superhuman. "You know," Milton said over his second glass of wine, "when you told me you were recusing yourself, I thought you were letting him off. I know you did. I didn't understand what you were doing. I know that too." He swirled his wine. "You handed it to Paula, knowing she'd bury him." "I handed it to Paula," I said, "because I had a conflict of interest, and the rules require recusal. Everything else that happened was the natural consequence of a man who committed multiple serious federal crimes being properly prosecuted in a court of law." Milton looked at me for a long moment. "You've been practicing that sentence," he said. "I've been practicing that sentence," I agreed. He laughed. Daniel, asleep in the bassinet in the corner, stirred slightly and then settled. Grace refilled everyone's wine. Outside on Oleander Avenue, Savannah moved the way Savannah moves. Slow, Spanish moss draped, entirely indifferent to the dramas of the powerful. There is a moment in every trial, and I have presided over more than I can count, when you can see it on a defendant's face. The moment the verdict lands and the full weight of consequence arrives. Not the legal consequence, the human one. The moment when a person understands, perhaps for the first time, that the world is not actually arranged around their comfort. I wasn't in Paula's courtroom when Scott Davis heard guilty on all counts, but Gary Fontaine described it to me over the phone afterward. Not inappropriately, it was public record he was describing something anyone in that room could describe. And the word he used was stunned. Scott Davis was stunned. $4.2 billion. 53 years of the world rearranging itself. 53 years of walking away from everything he did to everyone he did it to, smiling, straightening his jacket, moving forward. And then, one Wednesday afternoon, he raised his hand in a hospital corridor and walked into the one situation in his 53 years that had been built, quietly, legally, precisely, to hold him. Daniel is 4 months old now. He has discovered his own hands and finds them endlessly fascinating, which I respect. He sleeps in the sage green nursery under the wooden letters of his name. He does not know, yet, the specific sequence of events that preceded his arrival in this world. He doesn't know about the corridor, or the footage, or the trial, or the 26 years. He will, someday. And when he asks me what I did, what his father, the federal judge, did when a man struck his mother and walked away smiling, I'm going to tell him the truth. I followed the rules, every single one of them. And the rules, when properly applied to a man who has spent his life believing they don't apply to him, are the most devastating thing in the world. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories.